Hello and welcome to the Undercut Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Jesse Billington, and we're back to review the first race of the Formula One 2024 season, the Bahrain Grand Prix. And it is a race that happened. Anyway, there's still some bits to actually pick over. So to get through them, I'm joined by my cadre of co-hosts, Ellie Mae Taylor and Thiemo Albus Daly. How are you both?
Eh.
Is that as good as we're going to get? Or is that your sum up of the race?
All that's currently going through my brain right now is just neh, 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 neh.
A lot of nonplussed noises. Thiemo, are you doing better than simply nonplussed?
I am, and I think that's mainly because it wasn't just Formula One this weekend, and I've had the feeder series, some NASCAR, some WEC, and a Nitrocross finale with a lot of different race categories within it to help balance out in a very much more positive way, but all of those combined
Yes,
than just the Formula One. And I think that's what is going to be necessary for all future Grand Prix this year if things go the way we expect them to. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Again, much like you, I enjoyed the tonic of Formula 2 and Formula 3 against the monotony of Formula 1, let's say. I didn't get a chance to watch any of the WEC or any of the NASCAR, but I did see that one guy who's like a senior in high school won his class and was in trucks and then was literally off to school again the next day. Yes. So that was quite exciting.
And then amusingly, the other feeder series, the guy last week whose roof came off his car in a NASCAR first, this week he spun out by himself and narrowly just managed to avoid everything going on in terms of other cars hitting him. I'm like, bad luck, mate. I don't look forward to seeing you next week.
Yeah, and then there was a rear wing, an entire rear body section that fell off in WEC as well. Was it one of the Peugeots or was it a Ferrari that lost its entire back end?
Ferrari, wasn't it?
I can't remember. But yeah, just
too many motorsport series in one weekend. But
too much
instead of just F1.
I think it was the number 51 Ferrari, wasn't it?
It could have been. They didn't have a great start to their season this year, James Caldo and Giovinazzi.
I love how with WEC, though, we've managed to get Eddie Mae's mind into, instead of meh, oh, it's the number 151 Ferrari, wasn't it? It's immediately focused.
Yeah, a slightly more interesting racing series. Oh, my attention is peaked. But anyway, we'll move back to the slightly less interesting race series of Formula One, and I think Liberty Media would hate us for calling it such. But there is at least some news that's been kicking out Paddock. Yeah, do a better job, make it more interesting. Which I think Christian Horner and Red Bull are trying to do. Because, of course, Christian Horner, we mentioned it in the preview, I think, that he had been cleared of inappropriate behaviour allegations, but it is now again being investigated after a Google Drive of 72 images and screenshots was leaked. And I put this in inverted commas because there's nothing to properly ascertain the validity of these messages, whether they were sort of leaked on purpose, genuinely by accident, or the full sort of circumstance around them. So that's all still up in the air. Red Bull reports have suggested that Red Bull are threatening to sue anyone that actually publishes them. So yeah.
Well, that was the fascinating thing. As soon as they were released, everyone's talking about it, but then you're like, we're in the article or the actual, oh, you're not publishing them. Is that because you can't actually verify anything? And so it's kind of weird to actually comment on anything, and why no one's really going to, because even if these are the genuine article, you kind of need to prove it, whoever you are, because otherwise, to call it Eddie Mae.
Yeah, if it's all made up, it's pretty defamatory as well, because it also implies who the other person was.
Yeah. There's no name.
Which I thought was quite interesting. It's kind of, you don't notice that straight away. Well, I didn't know straight away. You're too busy just reading, and then you're like, oh yeah, we actually might know who the person is that was at the center of all of it. And then you think,
Yeah, like if these are fraudulent, they're defamatory to not just Horner and Red Bull, but also the other person involved in this, which is just as serious as it is if it's against Horner. But if it is true, then it's also completely corrupted any further investigation because of sort of the public pressure that's then shifted onto it. So it's very strange.
And it kind of brings in that whole thing of, does the truth matter then? Because it's just public perception and they just do what is easier for PR purposes.
I mean, we'll get onto PR purposes. I think one of the interesting ones was Jerry Halliwell's presence throughout the paddock this weekend, and sort of her and Christian Horner being seen together in like what felt like a very Kardashian-esque manufactured couples appearance, just sort of like everything is fine.
Netflix, like, we know how to manufacture stuff. Well, our moment has come.
Yeah.
Let us help you.
So all interesting stuff there. I mean, if So obviously this got leaked to nearly 150 people, ranging from journalists to team principals and high-ups in the F1 and the FIA. And while this won't impact Red Bull, so to speak, it won't like the Red Bull Formula One team, if anything comes of it and Horner is found to have behaved inappropriately, he could get the same ban that we saw for Flavio Briatore post-Crashgate, which would see him booted from his role as TP and also denied access to the Formula One paddock.
Which would come back when they decide it's been enough time and it's not a complete life ban as it supposedly was for Briatore.
Yeah. Equally,
just like to remind people.
Stefano Domenicali goes on holiday regularly with Flavio Briatore. So it's a very small, and I don't want to use the phrase incestuous because it's the wrong situation, but you get the gesture. The other interesting aspect to it is...
Cartel like.
The other interesting aspect is how Jos Verstappen has spoken out about this. So you've got genuinely...
Well, he's not been in the headlines for 5 minutes saying something or other, has he? So.
But this is the thing. You've all of a sudden got, like, certified wife beater standing up against certified sex pest or nearly certified, possibly certified sex pest. So sort of going, this is just two sides of a bad penny and they're having an argument. He's the worst.
Notice how Eddie May and I will not comment anything there so we don't get dragged into your lawsuit.
Well, one, he was genuinely found to have beaten his wife.
From that statement.
Well, he was genuinely found and arrested and charged for spousal abuse. Jos Verstappen.
Oh no, not just Verstappen.
That bit wasn't the bit we were going to for.
And that was why I said alleged or supposed. I followed it up with alleged or supposed. So we're fine. Like, it hasn't been proven either way yet, but it's two sides of a bad penny. And unfortunately, you're sort of left going, I think Jos is correct that Red Bull need to sort this out soon because it is going to start tearing the team apart and causing problems. And already it's sort of sparked allegations of Max to Mercedes in 2026. You're going, really? Really? I don't think so.
I think the least exciting thing that they could do with that seat for me
is put Max Verstappen in it. But anyway, we'll move on from stuff that's all still alleged and isn't really news because nothing's actually been happened officially with it, to Formula One becoming the first motorsports competition to use Pirelli FSC-certified tyres. We mentioned this back ahead of the Austin Grand Prix, I want to say, the one last year when they first announced it as an initiative. And Pirelli have become the first company to produce a complete range of FSC, which is Forest Stewardship Council certified tyres for motorsport, with all of the tyres used in the F1 World Champion this year set to be marked with the FSC logo, which is a little tree one. And what it means is that the natural rubber from within the tyre complies with stringent environmental and social criteria required by FSC, which is a world-leading non-governmental organisation for sustainable forestry. So it's a good step in the right direction, similar to what we saw with IndyCar using their cactus rubber source tyres. It is steps in the right direction to look at the other pollutants and other products used within Formula One. Another thing that's down the same line was zero petroleum. I don't know if anyone spotted this. Paddy Lowe, the former F1 engineer, was there in the paddock this weekend with Zero Petroleum, who've got their name on the side of the Sauber. And that is a completely carbon neutral petrol-based compound that they're working on. So essentially it works on carbon recapture and uses sustainably generated electricity, so geothermal, solar, wind, to spark that backwards into petrol. And it's very interesting what they're working on there. It's interesting to see this big-ish arrival of a low-impact petrol to the world of Formula One, which, if it can be sort of done at a scale that's required, would mean you can get rid of the hybrid systems and make the cars smaller, lighter, more agile, and better for racing if your petrol all of a sudden isn't polluting. So you lose the sort of need to have the hybrids for sort of sustainability and real-world impact. So interesting steps there.
I did think it's interesting how even Martin Brundle said during race commentary how hybrid was the worst, not the worst way to go, but it was not the correct way to go. He wishes it didn't happen.
It's the long term.
It's one of the reasons he's in my winners list for later.
I mean, when you look at it, like IndyCar keep taunting the idea of like bringing in a hybrid iteration of their car, and you look at the World Rally Series, which introduced hybridization, found that it wasn't really great for rally cars and got rid of it in the same span of time. And then WEC have started getting around to introducing hydrogen as a class. So essentially loads of other global series have introduced, used, utilized and disposed of hybrid systems before IndyCar has ever actually gotten around to doing its hybrid systems, which is always quite funny looking at the slightly backward nature of IndyCar. But we'll move back to Formula One rather from IndyCar. And an interesting point of note is that this race was won by the largest margin of any Bahrain Grand Prix, and it marks the first time in the sport's history that the first race of the season was finished by all the entrants. So weird little records to break there, but
closer racing indeed.
Yeah, closer racing indeed. Everyone finished.
I'd say kudos though to all the teams to manage to get a reliable.
It's one of those weirdly impressive things that you want to congratulate for, but at the same time you're like, I feel like we're gonna be swapping places by the end of this anyway, and I'm just gonna be
That's still what's just going through my brain currently. Just,
Getting on board with it as we get through this and start remembering what happened over this weekend.
Yeah, we'll start diving into those entire 20 finishes. We'll split it all down by teams. We're doing a slightly different structure this year, so we'll see how this works. But we'll start with Red Bull, obviously now leading the team's championship after a successful 1-2 fastest lap and P1 in qualifying. So, Thiemo, your notes on it are relatively short.
Yeah, I'd just like to congratulate them on the 2024 driver and constructors titles. I've not really got much else to say there.
Yeah, I don't even want to say it's premature. I think it's just sort of good predicting.
It doesn't even feel premature.
No. Looking at the performance across it, this is sort of leads nicely into my notes, which are sort of, you've got to hand it to them, really. Ruthless operators are not put off by all the paddock gossip around Horner. Really solid car, no real issues, and they resolved the shift problems that have been sort of pestering them through the practice sessions and into qualifying. It was overall a very dull performance, but from a performance and engineering standpoint, it is hella impressive what they're able to just put together.
It's that catch-22 thing of off of the cap, but also from any other perspective, you're just, again, I don't want to keep jumping back to it so quickly, but
yeah, catchword of the podcast.
Yeah, Perez,
can we have that as the title? Bahrain Grand Prix.
I might use that.
Perez fought, I think, from fifth through the field very well, but Max was just in a league of his own. By lap 7,
and also no one was surprised that Perez did that given the car.
He was pulling away from Perez there as well, and it was just he got such
it was this mixture of Max being Max and also knowing that Perez, despite what he may say and tell himself, he's not going to do anything.
No. He's got to up his qualifying game to actually stand a chance of getting close to Max this season. And unfortunately, when you're being split by, both the Ferraris and a Mercedes, wasn't it? He was behind on the grid. You've really got to sort of pull your thumb out and get up there a bit more if you want to have a chance of challenging Max, even into turn 1. Max disappeared off the line. Charles didn't have a great start, which exaggerated things.
I think what was it? I was looking at it lap 7, and he already had 5 seconds, and I was like, that is ridiculous. It's kind of one of the things you're less annoyed with it with Vettel and Hamilton in their respective eras because of the promises that we were made about this new era, that this was the exact opposite of what should have been happening, and the fact that you're getting not just domination but that level that quickly in a first race of the season. You're thinking
lap 7, you had a 10-second advantage from Russell.
Yeah, it's when you get to the point where you sort of barely up to sort of lap 10, 15, and you've already got a pit stop advantage, or you get to starting the second lap and you're already beyond DRS clear of the guy behind you. It's otherworldly. It's impressive.
Well, it's like Brundle was saying on commentary. Does he even know that the race is still going on? Does he just assume everyone else is there somewhere? He just can't see them because there's no one in front of him, no one behind him.
Well, the only time it got to people in front of him is lapping. Yeah. He got to also lap the sister cars, but we'll get to them in due course. We'll move on to Ferrari, who, despite sort of being Ferrari, second in the championship at the moment, don't know how long they'll hold on to that one for or throw it away for. But Thiemo, you've got some slightly longer notes for Ferrari. I say slightly longer.
So there's not going to be long notes for most of these teams for this Grand Prix for me, but I just always find it funny how, and this isn't Leclerc specific, it's a thing that applies to all the drivers, but he only really remembered how to race when it was against Sainz, but not against anyone else, and then still lost twice against him. And kind of, I know he had problems with the car, but this isn't the first time that we've seen the two of them fight and Sainz just outmaneuver him. And if it wasn't for Sainz, this race would have been truly forgettable in a lot more other ways, and he was the saviour of the Bahrain Grand Prix for me. and just showed that. I wonder, even if he was safe for next year with a contract, I still think he would have raced like that because there was that hunger for, fuck it. We might as well try something because why not? What is like, someone's got to take it to them. I was the only guy that managed to beat them last year. I guess I'll do it again.
Well, this was the argument George Russell was making, was it's a case of everyone knows who's winning, so the real race is always going to be for second place. You're still going to get the on-track action. You just have to discount Max Verstappen. And this is something that George pretty much publicly said in interviews, was that's how it goes. And it's not a secret. And coming out of the first race and having one of their drivers going, it's signed, sealed, delivered for him already. Oh, well. And I think Sainz knows that there is a very good chance that you look at the options available for him as a seat, and you look at the people he's in competition with for, say, the Mercedes seat, where it is the likes of Fernando Alonso, a two-time world champion, or the guy that's reported to be like the next Max Verstappen and Kimi Antonelli. You're Carlos Sainz, you're a two-time race winner. Great. Okay, cool. You don't really hold a candle to either of those options. So then you've got to look elsewhere for seats. You go to Red Bull, maybe, but then you've got the poison chalice of riding.
I think you just maximise what you can do on track, given that you've got Ferrari as a team and what that's like historically in the last, in the modern era, and go, well, I'll do it all myself and we can at least just stay relevant. And I think the best way to, if you want that Mercedes seat and stay relevant, or the Red Bull seat, is at the very least chase after the Red Bull and get that gap as low down as possible. And in the Mercedes case, beat them.
Yeah. In the case of Red Bull, all he's got to do is just absolutely start showing up Perez weekend out. And I think he's going to start doing that very quickly.
I mean, Sainz still had sort of he was steering with a tilt, didn't he? It was slightly tilted to the right to make sure that he could then drive straight. And I think, and sort of Charles then had braking issues. And I think despite that, they still looked like the stronger team up to Mercedes. I know Mercedes had their problems as well, but I think more so Sainz brought any kind of fight out of the four drivers in those two teams. And he was never probably going to catch Perez, but that gap was certainly a lot closer than...
It kind of felt like Alonso and Stroll when Alonso got past him, and he probably wasn't going to catch Hamilton. I think it was next up the road, but that gap was coming down and he was making a lot more inroads into him than Stroll was doing. And it's just like, well, got to try it at least. It's probably not going to work, but let's just see what we can do. And I think everyone, understandably, is a bit defeatist already coming into the season, but you've got one or two people who are there like, you've got to bloody try at least a little bit. Maybe we still get the same outcome, but you're not going to know if you don't at least, might as well throw the kitchen sink at it. And if it doesn't work, then at least we know. But you'd rather try and fail than just not even bother to try in the first place, which I feel like is a lot of the mentality or the perception that we're getting from most of the people.
I think that wraps up Ferrari quite well. So we'll dip into Mercedes. We've already mentioned them a little bit. And for me, they really could have been a lot closer to the top, but the finishing order really shook the teams down and sort of put the top 10 teams-wise and drivers-wise into their actual pace. And Mercedes were hampered this weekend by sort of major cooling issues. They were running a car that ran hot. Lewis's seat broke. George was battling against a car that just would not come down off of a heat scale. So there was major problems with the Mercedes. It's settling in. It's fine-tuning at this point, because you've got to bear in mind, they've had 3 days of testing, like 3 days to get it ready. No other sport do you go into it with just 3 days preparation. You don't look at people going into ATP World Tours having done 3 days.
Looked promising at times as well for them, so it was kind of frustrating that it looked like they were on top of whatever issues that they were having in testing, and that they'd figured it out a little bit, and then it just kind of unraveled immediately. And for a team like that, it is just disappointing. But I think that's because we saw what they were doing. Like, okay, they've moved away from what has been failing them. And okay, maybe we wouldn't expect them to hit the nail on the head immediately, but kind of hoping that these sorts of issues, I know it's the first race of the season, but showing the reliability that we've got across the grid in terms of just cars finishing, you'd hope that these problems, especially a seat breaking, wouldn't be the kind of thing that's scuppering you in a race.
And certainly not scuppering Mercedes.
George Russell as well said, the cooling issues were down to the wrong setup, and that, they have a better cooling system, then that shouldn't be an issue for Saudi Arabia. But this was a pretty cold race, so I don't think we're going to see those issues fully go away, no matter sort of how sort of much Russell kind of dulls down it. I think, I know it's the start of the season, so they have plenty of time to work on that. But again, it just felt a bit.
When this season feels so much like just a natural continuation of the last season, you know that even if they get on top of those problems, by the time they do, it'll be too bloody late because a certain other team will be about 200 light years ahead of them.
Yeah, so the Red Bull will be uncatchable at that point. But that's the thing, like Bahrain, this was a relatively cold Bahrain. Like you listen to people that are doing pit lane reporting or when they're recording
like 17, 18 degrees or something.
Yeah, which for Bahrain is chilly in reality. And even then, if you're struggling with overheating at that point, and not overheating like the Williams of Logan Sargent thought it was, but like genuinely your car is just hot. That suggests that going into the rest of the hot races that we've got lined up, i.e. Saudi Arabia, Australia, China is going to be fairly warm by the time we get to there in early spring, as is possibly Japan. So we've got some hot races starting off the season, and Mercedes are going to have to work double quick time to actually get updated cooling into the, even if they just open up the side vents along the sort of top of the engine cowl, they're going to have to think of something. But speaking of upgrades, actually, Helmut Marko has already said that there's upgrades planned for the Red Bull for Imola, and they said it's going to take a step forwards. I'm like, step forward to where? The moon? It's already 22 seconds ahead. To be fair,
upgrades you'd kind of hope would be a step forward and not a step backwards, because otherwise they're not upgrades.
The step forward is a given, but we've seen teams sort of try to make upgrades and not work. But yeah, we'll move on from Mercedes to...
They've said it would be major upgrades as well, sort of going more into the summer, and it's like, do you want a minute gap?
Yeah,
between sort of Max Verstappen and everyone else.
It's this weird thing as a fan. I kind of do want that, just despite the minute early, and go, this is the issue. Fix this.
Adrian Newey is the issue.
Adrian Newey has written above his desk the results of the 1969 F1 Grand Prix in Spain, where Jackie Stewart won by 2 laps, 3 minutes 59 seconds.
Was that in Spa?
Spain.
Yeah. I just know he did a very good job.
He did a similar. Spa is a good one for getting a long way ahead, but he's got Spain written down. That's 1969 Spain race, and is looking to try and get that one written out of the history books as well.
Verstappen's going to finish the race, and Alpine is still going to be on the first lap.
Yeah, Alpine won't have got round to their first pit stop yet. Or Bottas will still be stuck in his pit stop, but we'll get to them in due course. McLaren, and I'll kick off my one, and with not the worst weekend, especially when you look at their results, it's about average. It's about where you'd want to peg them as a team. So for sort of getting eased into the season, this is exactly what you want as Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri.
My notes are actually longer than they were initially going to be, because I was desperately trying to find something. Yeah, I know. I was desperately trying to find something just to say. And I was like, to be fair, better than the last 2 Bahrain Grand Prix. That's about all you can say.
Yeah.
And kind of proof that Lando was moaning a lot out crew testing and seemed very downbeaten, which was quite amusing because Ricardo was joined a big habits about it, like, oh, that's just his face. And I just thought, you're still there, though. You're not doing worse than you were before. And I think at the moment, that's probably the best you could hope for. I don't know what you were maybe expecting to have a magic solution to everything and just take it to Red Bull this year. I think he realistically knew that was impossible. And maybe he just talked himself into thinking that it would be better than it actually was. But like you said, not the worst weekend, and it's better than you at least finished this Grand Prix as opposed to the one last year, and you got points. So, shush.
Yeah, I think Norris was disappointed with where he finished in qualifying, as he didn't quite have the best of laps. But you've got to think that in some ways is a positive, because you know that there is more coming from the McLaren. And like you said, it's significantly better than where they were in Bahrain last year and even the year before. So to build on sort of what they've got currently, hopefully we will be seeing better results from them throughout the season. But I don't think this is a bad baseline to go off at all.
Especially when Piastri is finishing P2 in the championship this year.
According to some predictions. Aston Martin, though, I will get on to Lance Stroll a bit later, because I was quite impressed with what he got up to this weekend. But otherwise, a bit like McLaren, it was sort of a good sounding out round for Aston Martin to sort of go, okay, this works, this doesn't, this is what pace we've got, this is what we need to look at. Essentially, glorified testing session for a lot of these guys.
I feel like Alonso and I are on the same spiritual level at the moment because him being he can't. No, there's a logic. I feel like he was being tactical for the season in his very minimalist approach for the race, in that he really wasn't fighting at all the drivers he knew were just going to get past him anyway. He was just doing his thing, and you saw that in qualifying. He just came out Q3, did one lap, was good enough for P3 at that point, went down to P5, and just like, okay, done. Kind of like what you were saying, Jesse, it's a testing session, but we're just going to nail this stuff and what we can do. We're not going to try and go out of the bounds of it. And I feel that's the same way as I'm approaching the season in terms of minimalist. I'll get excited for certain things maybe, but I'm going to take this big step back and just look at it from like that drone that follows the car rather than being in the driver's seat. And just felt like he was just going through the motion like, okay, job done. It's a long year. I'm going to focus on the races where we actually stand more of a chance. And these ones, I'm just going to make sure that we get the maximum, but I'm not going to push it.
Yeah, get the maximum available. There's no point challenging for anything beyond what's sort of at risk sort of thing. So it's metered.
Yeah, I really sort of have no notes on them. Like for me, they're about where I expected them to be.
They were also there.
So
it's kind of like Martin Brundle said, the top 5 teams were in the points. And you're like, oh shit.
Yeah, that's what's that was what you expected to happen.
Yeah,
when it comes
it's basically like what you said earlier on, in that it's just a continuation of last year.
Yeah, by and large. Like if you said this was sort of the results from Austin, I'd be like, yeah, no, that tracks. I can see that. Yeah. We move on from sort of relatively straightforward to a bit shaken up and spicy, or RB, because RB is actually relatively straightforward to say, unlike Sauber. So
that was quite easy to say.
Sauber was quite easy to say, but if you give them their full name, it's a bit trickier, depending on what country you're in, as to whether or not you're allowed to say half of it. But anyway, the RB, the sister team to Red Bull, I think you and I are going to come to loggerheads over this one, Thiemo.
Well, thank God, because something's got to happen. My only reason for this, though, is because of when we talk about Alpine a little bit, but I might just mix it a little bit now, because for me, I don't appreciate Yuki's team radio and his antics after, I was going to say after the class, but after the Grand Prix. Because whilst I can understand why he would be annoyed in that situation, and I'm not saying I wouldn't be, you can be as annoyed as you want, but I think the mature professional thing to do is to just say, yes, boss, okay, but I want to talk, and then maximally say back on the radios, I want to talk about this after the race, or you just talk, then don't say that and you talk about it after the race. And I think Ricciardo was a little bit guilty of that as well because of his team radio when Yuki did his antics on the cooldown lap, but he then caught himself a lot in the interviews and whatever after by kind of measuring himself and going, I'm not going to say what I want to say. I'm just going to cool it on that one. It's something we'll deal with later. And I think whilst Yuki was ahead of him in qualifying, it was kind of the first time all weekend that he was ahead of Ricciardo. And if he did have that extra pace, then he should have just shut it and overtaken him and gotten past Magnussen instead of being in the position where he's being asked to move over in the first place, because if you were that close, get over it. But maybe the team should have also either asked him to move over sooner so that Ricciardo had more time to do it, because the tyre life was obviously not great, or Yuki just decided to wait a little bit more than he was meant to before letting Ricciardo get through. And also at this point, you're not even fighting for points, you're fighting for count back, essentially. And there's not really much to gain this. It's more the team should be put first at this point. You've clearly not made a copy of the Red Bull from last year, so you're not in a position where this really matters in a big way yet in terms of points. So just let it happen, and if you're going to be complaining, just do your talking on track. And weirdly, to go into the Alpine point that I'm going to make and just do 2 birds with 1 stone, they had a flipping torrid time of it, but I've got to give kudos to Ocon here, which is a weird thing for me to say. And Yuki should maybe take a leaf out of his book and just be professional and praise the team on the radio and say, I trust you guys, or we're going to talk about this later. There's clearly something that I disagree with here, but just approach it in a more level-headed way. And it just comes across that year one Yuki was angry and immature and all the rest of it. And it doesn't feel like we've had as much growth as we should have done in this time that we've had him with.
I'm not trying or not going to try and defend Yuki's antics, but I will say that he was thrown on the bus with the strategy. He's trying to chase down Magnussen, who's on younger and softer compound tyres. In reality, the fight is against him at that point. Danny Rick is on a different strategy, but still on a harder compound of tyre, a slower tyre than Magnussen. The chance of him getting past as well. And there were opportunities he could have done a Daniel Ricciardo late move and done his usual thing and made that pass, but he didn't. Neither of them acted great about it. I wasn't pleased with either of them in the media pens afterwards. Either of them, there were antics after the race. But I think Yuki was definitely thrown on the bus with the strategy. He raced well against it. His practice sessions, though hard to read, showed good pace. It just needs to be converted into genuine race pace for both cars. But I think, for Yuki, this wasn't his finest moment of behaviour.
There is opportunity for him to show why he's worthy of the Red Bull seat in other ways and not just being what we know he can. Like, we know that this is how you're going to react. And it's kind of when Ocon came on the radio after qualifying, Brundle came on afterwards and went, I was surprised we didn't hear more expletives there. That's quite refreshing. And everyone's kind of nicely surprised by it.
Really, really good and genuinely very mature and sort of the thing you'd expect to hear from a driver that is vying to sort of prove that they're team leader as well. With Tsunoda,
he missed the opportunity. And I get why, but it just seemed like if you'd just taken it, it's kind of Ricciardo missed as well, but he caught himself later on, whereas Yuki just didn't.
I think Ricciardo could have done better catching it later on by simply not saying anything at all, as opposed to sort of saying, "Oh, I stopped myself from saying something mean there," which simply implies that you were going.
That's just Ricciardo.
No, but you might as well have just said it regardless at that point. But with Yuki and Daniel, you depending on which way you're polarized on it, it depends on which way you argue it. You either go that Daniel is fighting for the Red Bull seat, or Yuki is fighting for the Red Bull seat, or Yuki is not fighting for the Red Bull seat. He's fighting to prove why Daniel shouldn't have it. And it's very much the childish argument of, if I can't have it, you can't have it. And I think that could very quickly become the undoing of the team. And I would hope they quash this out within the first sort of 4 or 5 races and quickly go, look, the two of you, stop bickering, grow up. Whichever of you is fastest on the day will get
Liam Lawson just sitting in the sidelines going, go on, keep going. I'll get one of you.
Because ultimately, Daniel is under the pressure to prove that he is the faster of the two of them. Because if the opportunity comes up, he will be the one that replaces Perez. But equally, he knows that if Yuki is faster, there will be public outcry. People across Formula One will be going, well, hang on, why didn't you simply pick the faster driver, which it might be Yuki, to replace Perez? It'd be a daft move. And I'll get onto it more later when we come to our winners and spinners, but that's all I want to say on RB.
I think it's a tricky situation. I mean, apparently they had spoken prior to the race that they would be on different strategies and Ricciardo may be quicker of the two near the end. I think the team themselves perhaps called the swap bit too late, and then Tsunoda then didn't move out of the way quick enough, and then it was then hampered because they had to get out of the way of Max. So the advantage Ricciardo had being on the quick tyre just quickly diminished, and he couldn't really make anything out of it. So
it's one of those first race things that needs to be sorted sooner, but then that makes me more annoyed at the drivers in different ways there, because again, it's a first race. You think calm. It's not, we've clearly not everything perfect. There's been a lot of changes behind the scenes going on. We weren't going to nail it immediately, and this kind of stuff in public airing of the laundry isn't going to help with that. So there we go. But anyway, Williams, as you're the only one with notes on it, Jesse.
I thought this was actually a really solid mid-tier entry for them. Worried a bit about the advances in steering wheel design, which saw Sargent's steering wheel shifting a lot of his settings for him, leading to some very strange lockups and moments. Like, just the tech of it had a mind of its own for a brief phase. But he got going again,
and
moved on from
working.
it. Yeah, Albon screen not working. Like, it's new tech. They were building it out of a factory that sort of was still built and running in the 80s. So they're trying to make modern tech with outdated equipment. It's never going to be perfect. But the fact that both drivers are able to sort of shrug that off and keep pushing on and sort of be quite mature about it. In other words, the antithesis to the Minardi boys. So actually quite refreshing to see that, and relatively sort of upbeat on what they've got the potential to achieve this year. I think last year we got a bit, or previous years we've gotten lucky with Albon scoring points in Bahrain, but that was because the car was a bit of a straight line speed demon, which you can utilize a lot around the 4 big straights of Bahrain. this year their car's a bit more well-rounded, so it might not sort of dominate at speed circuits, but it's going to have a better chance everywhere else. So it's a step forward for them, and equally it's really nice to see the maturity and the ability for both of them to get their head down when something has gone wrong. And certainly for Sargent, it wasn't the overall big step forwards we're expecting post winter break, but his ability to not get flustered when things have gone wrong and keep up a fairly decent race pace to work.
And it wasn't really his fault.
Yeah, it wasn't a problem he had caused himself, and he recovered from it relatively well given the technology he was provided with. So I think all round that's quite reasonable.
I think the issue for me is when we looked at Albon's dashboard, it kept saying that the engine was overheating. And, is that going to cause more issues in the future? It's a bit like Mercedes. Obviously, they've got the same engines.
I think the Mercedes overheating is different to what the Williams was showing, and the Williams one was likely due to false sensors and false positives coming through on the electric systems. The car itself was performing fine, and the readouts that they were getting on pit wall were reportedly fine. So this was purely a Williams electronics issue, more so than their Mercedes power plant. But it is one of those things that you look at where the Mercedes as a power units come against the Honda in a good chassis and the Ferrari in a good chassis. The Mercedes is the third quickest engine this year on the face of it. Like, if Williams they're going to have a bit of an uphill battle. Admittedly, they haven't got the Renault engine in the back, which is standing them in good stead, at least in one instant. But yeah, it's something they'll obviously be keeping an eye on, especially if you're seeing the big team that knows how to package that engine getting problems. They do have the advantage of running an older style gearbox. They might have a slightly more open back end of the body cowl, so it might get better airflow. There is still a few advantages to be had to using an old design.
Before the new regulations came in, didn't Mercedes slightly struggle with sort of overheating a bit, but it never sort of caused such an issue? And then is it perhaps sort of the new regulations that have hurt it more?
There might have been instances pre-2022 where they struggled a bit. There were definitely moments, but equally they had a sort of confidence all around the rest of the time to sort of be able to sort of lift and coast and avoid it. Like, there were definitely moments in 2020, 2021 where they were suffering exhaust sensor failures over rough curbs. No sort of power unit or system is completely infallible, apart from maybe the Honda ones of late. But I think it's just that thing of when you've combined 700 moving parts plus a hugely complex hybrid system on top of that, it's ultimately going to have a weak spot. It's tricky to make that level of technology perfect. Speaking of making things perfect, or rather failing to do so, Stake and Thiemo, you've got some notes, short ones again.
Formula One is a sport where we try to break all kinds of records, but Bottas and Stake, these are not the kind of records we're trying to break here. So please just give him a better pit stop next time.
Yeah.
And silver lining, for me at least, we got to see that sweet, sweet livery.
Yeah, I'll start with the livery point. I think it looks better on the F2 car. The F2 Stake car looks fantastic, and we saw a lot of it this weekend with some fantastic driving from our favourite Barbudan boy. But when it comes to Bottas and Zhou, Bottas very much an F weekend. I think they learned a lot about the car. Really impressive work from Zhou. Made a lot of the strategy, made a lot of it being a relatively...
It's a shame Bottas got bungled in a lot of ways, because it would have been interesting to see how close to Zhou
he was able to
top 10 he would have been able to get them. Because I don't think we were expecting much from them this year. But if that's edge of point, then that means that surely on some tracks that have to favour them, they might get a couple.
Yeah, Zhou being able to get it up there really gives us a sort of a good hit. And equally, given how close the two of them have been over the previous season, suggests that there is every chance that when those moments come, it's not necessarily going to be given that it's Bottas that collects the points. It's going to be an interesting sort of scrap, definitely around that sort of midfield tail end of the points as we move on.
Zhou benefited quite well from pitting early and getting the undercut on people, but I think it was a nice solid drive for him in general. Obviously, like you said, we can't really tell what Bottas's pace would have been like, because it was obviously hampered for that pit stop, and obviously you can't blame him for that. So yeah, I think we'll just have to wait and see sort of what they can both do sort of later on.
What they can do moving forwards. From one Ferrari engine team to the next, and Haas, who really some interesting bits coming out of that this weekend. And I'd say they're hard to read early on, but on a high deg circuit, it very much seems that they've sorted their tyre wear issues and built some race pace into the car from there as well. So it's certainly a step forwards in design. It's by no means a perfect car or perfect chassis. It still seemed to really struggle through the race, and it did not have the pace of things like the Sauber or the Williams or the RBs. But on a good tyre with a good run, especially over one lap, we know that Hulkenberg's able to turn the pace out of it.
I mean, in
Yeah,
a
but
very
he still knows how to qualify.
Yeah, in a very closely knit pack that it is at the minute, Hulkenberg did exceptionally well to get into Q3. I mean, I guess in the race we didn't particularly hear of Haas cooking their tyres earlier than the rest of them and pitting any earlier and falling down the pack as a result, like we saw last year. So hopefully they are on their way to improving their tyre degradation, and that means they might be a bit punchier in the races as the season go on. But that was obviously their big issue last year. So I think going forward, even if they haven't improved pace as such, I think tyre degradation was the biggest thing that they needed to work on to have any chance of being in the points, whether it's sort of by chance or on own merit.
And equally now they've got a car.
The one thing that did bother me with them, though, is the fact that I get that Hulkenberg got compromised at the start with everything that happened there, but why they had to pit him so much just annoyed me, because it felt like they just bungled that whole thing there with it, and kind of going soft to hard made sense, but then pitting him so soon for another pair of hards to then go onto the softs when you've got mediums available to you. And just, it seemed a weird thing to try out, because you're not really, by the time he's gained even a small foothold, he then loses again because you're pitting him for some reason. And it didn't seem like you'd get away with saying this is just us trying to get some data and information. It felt like you're just using that to cover the fact that you bungled it a bit in terms of how you would do a recovery, because normally you just have the situation, stick them on the hards and just leave them to it, and just hope that you get a late safety car made, and then, or just come in towards the end and have softs when they're still alive, and you can maybe do a bit with that. Whereas it's just kept saying, he's made progress, right? Let's bring him in so we can screw that up again, all right? And that's just rinse and repeat.
I think it's glorified testing again. I think Haas genuinely, once they knew Hulkenberg had done that, they must have been in agreement with him over the radio, sort of going, look, you can either try and claw it back up and get something, or we think we're starting to understand how this car works in a race situation with all the dirty air of other cars around it. This is going to be valuable information for later on the season at well-known circuits at things like Silverstone, Suzuka, Spain, Austin. Knowing exactly what your tyre is going to be doing at those races where you can capitalize, that makes a hell of a lot more sense for Haas to work on that, rather than, like you said, sort of forcing Hulkenberg
like
right the way up to P12.
Just be minimalist and don't kind of try and go beyond your brief.
Their goals shifted from maybe P13 in this race to how much can we know about this car coming out of it?
In the championship.
Yeah, P13 in the championship would be a bit bold, but like their goal obviously shifted from not necessarily trying to drive for 1 point of P10, more to we're better off with this data and knowing what the car's going to do and get points later on, more solid points later on. So I think it was a long gamble, and I think it's going to pay off for Haas. But it was a strange strategy, certainly. But I think in the long run, it might work for them. Speaking of strange, or at least hoping things work out for them, Alpine. And Thiemo, you've already mentioned your one, which was obviously Ocon being very kind, courteous, and a solid team leader on the radio, I think. It was nice to see.
Not really anything else to say on that one, because we can all easily just comment on the situation there and how it could probably all be stemmed back to firing Cyril, and maybe they shouldn't have done that.
Yeah, this tails back to the absence of Cyril Beatable and the way that it's badly spun on from there. And obviously, we read over winter, there's been a few people leaving. That's not the end of it. It's going to be a long and rough season for them. And technical director Matt Harmon and their head of aerodynamics, Dirk de Beer, have both resigned from the team after this race. And this very much spins off from my pre-race monologue in the preview on their future and goals as a team. Clearly, they've already binned off any structure they might have worked towards this year. And it's very much crushed my hopes that they could be a good and challenging middle field contender, mixing it up with Mercedes, Aston Martin and RB. But at the moment, they're struggling to find pace against Logan Sargent and Haas. And it's going to be grueling if you're a proper Alpine fan, like dyed-in-the-wool Alpine fan this year. Best of luck to you.
I think the only saving grace is that Gasly didn't do particularly well in Bahrain last year, but they've got a hell of a long way to go. I mean, if they want to do
Gordon did a
something,
lot better than last year as well, actually, with lack of penalties. So it was good.
yeah,
I'm trying to find something for him.
I mean, if they want to do something like what McLaren did last year and sort of turn it all back around, then it just harks back to what we were saying in the preview. They need stability in that team, and I don't know where they're going to get it from.
Yeah, McLaren were able to do that because Zach Brown and Andrea were able to sort of bring together a really strong team and have like constant sort of engineers and mechanics that are working together on one project for over a year leading up to that point. Like they understood what they were working together as a collective. Alpine does not have that at the moment. Getting rid of and seeing so many of its major people leaving is going to be a sort of big sucker punch for them moving into the first half of the season where they'll be bringing in big upgrades, or all the other teams will be. If Alpine can't keep up in the upgrades race, that's when we know they're in dire straits. And it's a team that's always sort of struggled a bit financially. Like look back to its Lotus days, big problems there. And we'll see what happens from this point moving forwards. But I don't want to slam on Alpine too much. We've already done it, and I think at this point it's very much sort of beating a dead horse. It's obvious. So we'll move into our winners and spinners. And Thiemo, we'll go for your winner.
I really had to search for this, but I felt there was an obvious choice, but I didn't want to go for that, and also Ellie May would have get annoyed with me. So, in the spirit of trying to avoid that, I went for Joe because, as we mentioned, better than we probably thought him and the team were going to do, and they had a nice little strategy for him, and probably weren't going to get in the points barring any DNFs. But if there had been, he was perfectly poised to take advantage of it, whilst everyone else was bickering and being Alpine behind them. But I also want to give a shout out to Martin Brundle for what I was referring to at the top of the episode that Ellie May referenced with his commentary, because he seems done in a lot of ways with the current iteration and regulations of Formula One, and for his interview with Clarkson on the starting grid. If you saw that, and if you didn't, it's a very nice 1 minute 20. I recommend watching, because Clarkson basically tells it how it is and does so on the main, essentially, channel for Formula One in not just the UK, but many countries around the world, and just says what we're all thinking that F1 don't want us to hear in terms of what has everyone actually been doing over the winter. It's you've not really done, it's exactly the same. And going back to what we were saying earlier, anyway, it's just a continuation of last year. We picked up where we left off, and we're just going for round 2 at these tracks now instead. And I just loved him for just being very real about it and not going, I've been bored enough to look through the details and the lap times, and
very bored about it, very drunk about it as well, quite clearly. Very inebriated.
Hawkstone's great beer.
It is really good beer. I've had a couple of them. They're very enjoyable, especially the point where he said, when he was asked, who are you backing this season? He said Adrian Newey, and I believe they went to school together. So very interesting on that side of things.
Yeah. Oh, just amusing that he just, Martin asked him, who's going to win tonight? And he just kind of gave that look before he said Adrian Newey, and you're just like, yeah, who else am I going to say here? There's only going to be one person who's going to win this, regardless of whatever happens. It's going to be Verstappen.
When it comes to my winner, though, Lance Stroll. And it's not something you hear me say very often, but I'm growing a bit of a soft spot for the lad. And this was a pretty sound recovery after being spun by Hülkenberg, who looked like they got a bit of a bump from behind as well. So this isn't entirely Hülkenberg's fault either. The drive was lacking in flamboyance, but it still proved to be a very competent drive and really made the most of the chassis. Like we were saying with Aston Martin in general, this is very much a case of let's get the most of what we can from this without sort of risking too much and throwing it all away. So a really good opening round for Stroll. And I think if the car's able to develop and keep up with the rest around it, we could see him sort of towards the points again for the rest of the season, which is it's nice.
I think you need to go to the doctor. You're clearly having some kind of head issue going on in terms of it's gotten so dire that you're supporting Lance Stroll, but I'll just let you get on with it.
He did do well, though, to come back and get... I mean, he obeyed team orders and let Alonso pass, so he could have finished ninth.
Well done. You managed to do the bare minimum.
I mean, we were praising them
and
earlier.
Also, even if he resisted team orders, do you honestly think in a head-to-head fight Alonso was going to lose that?
Yeah.
Not
There's
on
no
the
point in
newer
making it
tyres,
worse.
but
Not on any kind of compound. He could have had weaker tyres to get past him.
We'll wait and see. That might come up later on this season. We'll move into spinners, though. And
no, it
Thiemo,
won't.
oh, you've already said yours, have you not?
No.
It's Sainz.
Oh, thanks. Is that where we're just moving on now?
Well, I mean, have you got some more to add to it other than being the only non-Red Bull driver on the podium?
Wouldn't know, you didn't ask her.
Yeah.
Well,
he was much stronger of the two Ferraris, obviously, during the race. I mean, he had some really punchy overtakes on Leclerc diving on the inside of turn one. I think obviously he's driving for a seat next year, and this is a really good start of showing the talent that he's got. And if anything had gone wrong with, the Red Bulls or like Perez, even if he had a little bit of an issue, he was right there to almost or very close to being able to sort of fight him for second.
he was hot on Perez's heels, and certainly towards the end of the race, I think Perez had taken a bit too much out of his tyres, and Sainz had enough to start catching back up to him. So he'd done well there, but I think it was a good drive from Sainz. I think it's undeniable that he's looking early on like one of the stronger of the two drivers, but we'll see how it develops through the rest of the season. Now we'll move into our spinners and Thiemo.
Formula One, because I know we've had some dull races in our time watching this sport. As any sport is going to do, you're going to have some races that are just simply more exciting than others, and somewhere it's just not going to be that great. But as Eddie May proved last year, you'll still be able to drag some kind of enjoyment out of those if you just ignore some other aspects of it. We love a tyre, don't we, Eddie May? But this Grand Prix, and with everything that F1 and Liberty are throwing at it and how great they want us all to think that it is, no offense to the Baja bugs in Nitro Cross, because that's a great little category itself, but I had so much more enjoyment from VW tools running around a track that got built in a month in Las Vegas, which looked like a better made track than the F1 one, by the way, where there were 4 changes for the lead and some truly wild racing than I did for the entirety of the Grand Prix. And when one is the pinnacle of motorsport and the other one is Baja bugs racing around Las Vegas, you should really be preferring the Formula One in every way, shape, or form. And it just kind of goes to show there, and I just think that they totally cocked up.
There we go. Ellie May, before I forget you then, your spinner, please.
Mercedes, because I think, as we were saying earlier, I just think the weekend was a bit meh from them. Obviously, we've already said about the overheating perhaps being a problem, perhaps not. I think Hamilton was just kind of there, and I think George was perhaps a bit too aggressive at the start, and that hurt him. It was sort of like, again, what Martin Brundle was saying in commentary, and I'm not sure who it was about or what they were talking about, but he was saying how once he overtook Niki Lauda during sort of near the start of a race, and Lauda a little later re-overtook him. He looked at him and said, "Passing is like, really? Like, what are you doing? You've still got so much of this race to go. Are you really going to push like that?" And I think it's kind of a similar situation here. And I think it then led really to Leclerc being able to pass him later on in the race.
It was a bit amateur hour from Mercedes across the board, I think, in the race at least. My spinner, though, and this comes back to what I was mentioning when we were talking about RB, and it's Ricciardo, really. Needed team orders to get past the guy who's only in F1 because of Honda. Sorry, fella, Tsunoda smacked you about in quali and had the run on you despite a worse strategy. Jacques Villeneuve, interestingly, was very scathing of him, saying that he's the product of perfect modern marketing. And while I wouldn't go that far, he's definitely good at branding himself.
Because it's Jacques Villeneuve, and everything he should be said should be taken with a pinch of salt and left in the Las Vegas wedding chapel that he sold himself out for.
A very large shovel full of salt. But he has a somewhat point here in the fact that Daniel Ricciardo is very good at branding himself and sort of selling himself and trading off of that. But when you're supposed to be ready to replace Perez at a moment's notice and you can't get past your teammate without help, it's not adding up. Like, if you're looking to be the guy...
I'm just going to go back to first race.
First race of the season,
shenanigans.
First race of the season is shenanigans. Everyone's excited to get going. But at the same time, if you're going to be the guy that wants to be challenging Verstappen for sort of championships and getting back into that top team, sort of jumped up and hyped, Honey Badger's back, baby, can't pass the guy that's in F1 because of Honda, and is on the worse strategy than you.
And the guy that is only there for Honda can't get past Haas. It's not much of a stick to shake at either of them then. So just put Liam Lawson in the Red Bull and be done with it.
All that too. We'll move on from spinners then to our predictions. And it's points for Ellie May and I this weekend. 2 points for Ellie May, 1 point for me, 0 points for Thiemo. Ellie May got hers for Verstappen pole and win. I got mine for Verstappen fastest lap. It seems that we might have been a bit too overzealous when it came to making our predictions early on in the season. They'll probably get tamed down as soon as we realise that I'm winning.
I'm very happy with my predictions. I'm bang on course. This is exactly what I want.
To score zeros across the board.
Yes, because even if I lose this, inevitably to Ellie May at the very least, then I get to do a big to Formula One for being so dull that not only even one of my slightly wild predictions comes true because it's just been an absolute snorefest. And if I do suddenly start getting points, we know the races have been interesting because of my wacky predictions. So I don't lose.
This is true. You do have sort of very much a win-win aspect to that. We'll move on from our predictions to something just as fanciful. Fantasy league. It's our fantasy league. Where are the results? Unless someone's got them written down. Highest score this week was Take a Stroll, which is a really nice team name. Doesn't even have Lance Stroll in it, mind you. 222 points. In fact, the fella that runs it has got the top 3 teams: John Seiler, John Siller, Take a Stroll, Doors by Gunter Steiner, and What's the Racing Point. So 222 points and 214 on the second 2. So doing nicely there. Ellie May, your team that's on the podcast account is in 13th, mine is 19th, and Thiemo's is 25th. So going well.
I'm just amazed my team's in the league because I don't know what F1 have done to the fantasy section of the website, but it seems to be a bit messed up at the moment.
The UX is terrible at the moment, I won't lie. But Ellie May, you're currently bottom of the rankings as well. 64 points for the greatest moustache. It's not doing too great there.
No, it's because I've definitely got Valtteri Bottas in there.
You've got Valtteri Bottas, Pierre Gasly, Fernando Alonso, Daniel Ricciardo, Lance Stroll, Aston Martin, Williams. And you threw an extra DRS at Fernando Alonso this weekend.
Yeah.
You threw a triple point scoring to the unknown of the first race of the season.
Yeah, why not?
Doesn't use them at all last year and then does that straight at jaws.
Next year she'll balance it out.
At least I had a no negative on my actual main one. And that had Pierre Gasly in it.
Yeah, very true.
Why did you put Pierre Gasly in your team full stop?
Well,
did you run out of budget?
I made them quite early on and thought, well, he'll be just a good midfield person to have. And then saw Alpine's pace, but I had already put the chip on, so I couldn't actually change it. So, so I was like, oh, well, I'm stuck with him.
Still,
not terrible disappointment.
Yeah, it's time to end. We'll be back with a preview of the Bahrain Grand Prix. The Bahrain Grand Prix. We've had that. We're back with a preview of the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, all the action from Jeddah, and a preview for the 2024 F1 Academy Series, which will kick off in Saudi Arabia as well. So some extra fantastic feeder series action that we'll be able to enjoy through the year. Hopefully, the Prema feeder series curse won't spread to F1 Academy because they've not had a great time with things in F2 or F3. So really hoping for Dorian Pin and Maya Wade that we're not going to get hit with that. But we'll wait and see. Who's the third one that races for Prema in F1 Academy? It's bad that I can't remember. Pin.
Is it Chloe Chong?
No,
she's racing in British.
Campos. Let me check the list. F1
Bianca?
Academy.
No, ART. That was last year. Yeah.
Tina Houseman. Yeah, Houseman, Pin and Wag for Prema. So hopefully things go well for them, but you'll have to wait and tune in with our preview of the F1 Academy season and, of course, our preview of Saudi Arabia. In the meantime, Thiemo, where can the people find you?
All the usual places, which will be in the description of this episode, but always on the Kerbs, where I've got a brand new interview out with Maria Fiorio, who has gone from having a very cool career in golf, being a pro there, to rallying, which is the natural segue that you'd have there.
Very nice. Ellie May, where can the people find you?
I don't know. I'm just unwell in every sense of the word at the minute, so
Send Ellie Mae medication. And in the meantime, you can find me on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok as @JesseOnCars, as well as writing for Classic Car Weekly. We've got a new issue coming out. I can't remember what the hell's in it this week. It's
Classic
interesting,
Cars, probably.
Classic Cars. Cars of a classic nature. Pick it up, read it. It's always going to be fantastic. In the meantime, we'll be back with some Saudi Arabian Formula One and F1 Academy previews.